Hello friends, in this video we're going to learn about participles. But first, let's look at an English proverb. We have a saying in English, it's no use crying over spilled milk. This proverb means it is not helpful to continue to be unhappy about something that has already happened because you can't change it. It's no use crying over spilled milk. We can also say this as there's no point crying over spilled milk or don't cry over spilled milk. Now, what does this have to do with participles? Well, in this proverb, we actually have two participles, crying and spilled. But what is a participle? A participle is a verb form that can also be used as an adjective. Now, if you're not sure what an adjective is a word that describes or modifies a noun. In English, we have two participle forms. We have past participles and present participles. For the past participle, we have a few different forms. So you might see an ed ending on a verb. For example, wanted, cooked, or fried. You might see an en ending on a verb, such as broken, fallen, or given. You might see a d ending on a verb like saved, paved, or lived. Now these ones, they look like an ed ending, but the original verb already has an e in it, like save or pave or live. We're just adding a d on the end. Whereas in these ones, like want, we are adding ed to it. So these ones are a little bit different. We'll also see past participles with a T at the end sometimes, like felt, dealt, or learnt. And some of the time, the T ending is specific to British English. So for example, in American English, we would say learned with an ED ending, but in British English, they would say learnt with a T. So that's a small difference between American English and British English. Sometimes you might see an NE ending on a verb. For example, go becomes gone in the past participle, do becomes done in the participle, and show becomes shown. And there are other forms as well that are past participles. Sometimes we change a vowel in the middle of a word. For example, sing becomes sung. Sometimes we can change almost the entire word. So teach becomes taught, for example. And sometimes we change nothing in the verb. For example, become and become are both the base form and the past participle. Now the present participle is actually easier than this because it's just the ing form of the verb. So bake becomes baking, cook becomes cooking, fry becomes frying. So these are our two participle forms in English, the past participle and the present participle. Now, as I said before, participles are verbs that can work as verbs or as adjectives. Now let's look at participles as verbs. For example, the present participle, this boy is spilling the milk, or the past participle, this boy has spilled the milk. So here we can see that the present participle is being used as a verb because it is an action and it comes after the subject, this boy. And here again, this boy has spilled the milk. We can see spilled here is working as a verb because it is an action and the subject here is boy. So it's coming after the subject. Now in English, verbs will come after a subject. So spilling and spilled are being used as verbs in these cases. Also, you can see with the verb here, there is a helping verb before it. So before spilling, we have is as a helping verb. And before spilled, we have has as a helping verb. So when a participle is being used as a main verb in a sentence, you will see a helping verb before it. When participles are being used as adjectives, you will see them at a different place in the sentence. For example, the present participle, the spilling milk will make a mess, or the past participle, the spilled milk has made a mess. So here, if we look at these sentences, the verb is actually will make or has made. Spilling or spilled are being used as adjectives. And in these sentences, they are coming before the noun that they are describing. So spilling is describing the milk, and spilled is describing the milk. So you can see that the participle is coming in a different place in the sentence because it's describing a noun, whereas if it's a verb, it will be after the noun that it's describing. Also notice here, there is no helping verb. We don't see is here, we don't see has here because it's not being used as a main verb. It's being used as an adjective. We can also use participles as phrases. For example, reaching for a cookie, the boy spilled his milk. So here, reaching for a cookie is what we would call a participle phrase because it's a group of words that starts with a participle. So we can say the participle is the head of the phrase here, reaching for a cookie. We could also say this as the boy reaching for a cookie spilled his milk. So reaching for a cookie, it's the same phrase that we saw here. We're just moving it after the boy. So when a participle is being used as a phrase, it's still working as an adjective here. So in the first case, reaching for a cookie is describing the boy. And in the second example here, reaching for the cookie is still describing the boy. So these phrases are working like adjectives. They're adjectivals, but they can go either at the beginning of the sentence, before the subject. They can go after the noun that they're describing. And we can even see them a little bit different here without the commas. So the boy reaching for a cookie spilled his milk. In the first one here, we see that there are commas on either side of the participle phrase, and here we have no commas. Now, what's the difference there? So we will use commas if the participle phrase is optional, meaning we don't have to have it. It's just some extra describing information. But if we need the participle phrase, then we will not use commas. It has to stay connected to the noun that it's describing. And this is usually the case when we are trying to be specific about which one we're talking about. So here we can see there are two boys, and we want to be specific which boy we are talking about. So we say the boy reaching for a cookie spilled his milk. So that means we're talking about this boy over here. Whereas if I say the boy scratching his head spilled the milk, then we're talking about this boy over here, not the one over here. So you can see this part of the sentence, this participle phrase is essential, meaning it's necessary. So we don't use commas with it. We can also use participle phrases in the past participle. For example, spilled all over the floor, the milk was a terrible mess. So again, we see the participle phrase at the beginning of the sentence, and it is describing the milk here. Which milk are we talking about? The milk spilled all over the floor. Or again, we can move that participle phrase after the noun it's describing and use commas to separate it. So spilled all over the floor, which is describing the milk. So the milk spilled all over the floor, but we're using the commas because we don't have to have this information because we only have one situation here. But if we need to be specific to show a comparison, then we will take away the commas to be specific which milk we're talking about. So the milk spilled all over the floor was a terrible mess, meaning we are talking about this milk over here, not this milk over here. Or we can say the milk spilled all over the table was a terrible mess. So spilled all over the table, this is the participle phrase, and it is describing this milk, not this milk over here. So again, if we use commas, then the information is not necessary. It's just extra information describing the noun. But if we take away the commas, that means the information is necessary to have in the sentence. Now, how do we know the difference? How do we know if a participle is being used as a verb or an adjective or a participle phrase? So I'm going to show you some things you can look for in the sentence to know the difference. So in the past participle, if it's being used as a verb, you will see a helping verb before it, somewhere before it. It could be either right before it, or if it's a question, you'll see the helping verb before the subject and the main verb after the subject. So for example, he has spilled the milk. So we look at this guy over here, he spilled the milk. So we have a helping verb has before the participle spilled. So we know that this is being used as a verb because it has a helping verb with it. We can also see this in the passive form. The milk was spilled. So again, we see our participle here, spilled, is the past participle, and we see a helping verb before it. Now here we have perfect forms and passive forms. So if the participle is being used in a perfect form, then you will see either have, has, or had before the verb. So we could say had spilled, has spilled, have spilled. So that would make it a perfect, past perfect, or present perfect. If it's being used as a passive form, then we will see a form of the be verb before spilled. So am, is, are, was, or were. So we could say is spilled, or was spilled, or were spilled. So you'll have some form of the be verb before the participle if it's a passive verb. So these are the two verb forms where you will see the past participle, either with the perfect forms or the passive forms. Now at the present participle, again, you will also see a helping verb with the ing of the present participle. So with the ing form, you'll see a form of the be verb. So am, is, are, was, or were. So you could say am crying, is crying, are crying, was crying, were crying. So if you see a be verb before the ing, then we are looking at a present participle verb. Now, if it's being used as an adjective, you won't see a helping verb. There's no helping verb with an adjective because it's an adjective, not a verb. And you'll see the participle where an adjective would go. So there are only a few places in a sentence where an adjective can go. For example, you'll see an adjective before a noun. So we see spilled milk. So spilled is the participle adjective describing milk because milk is the noun. Or you could see it after a linking verb. So the milk is spilled. So here's the linking verb. And we see spilled, again, is still describing the milk. Now in the present participle, it's the same thing. You'll see the ing form before the noun it's describing, or you'll see it after a linking verb. The man seems to be crying. So here seems is the linking verb, and crying is describing the man. So if it's an adjective, you will see it either before the noun it's describing or after a linking verb, almost all the time. And you will not see a helping verb with it. So if you don't see am, is, are, was, were, have, has, or had before it, then it's not a participle verb. It's an adjective. Now, if it's being used as a phrase, again, you'll see it either after the noun it's describing. For example, milk already spilled is a waste. Or you can see it before the noun at the beginning of a sentence. So spilled on the table, the milk took a while to clean. So here, already spilled, this is a participle phrase. It's describing the milk. And spilled on the table is a participle phrase describing the milk. So you're either going to see it after the noun it's describing or before the noun it's describing with a comma there. And again, if it's being used as a participle phrase, you will not see a helping verb with it. So there's no helping verb here. There's no helping verb here. It's just a group of words. If it's the present participle, again, you can see it after the noun it's describing. So the man crying is the one who spilled the milk. So here it's coming after the noun it's describing. Or you can see it before the noun it's describing. For For example, crying like a baby, the man cleaned up the milk. So crying like a baby is a participle phrase describing the man. So again, if it is a participle phrase, it is being used as an adjective. So it will come before the noun it's describing, but it'll have a comma, or it'll come after the noun it's describing. It could have a comma, or it might not. So let's practice a little bit. Look at this sentence. This child is crying because the milk is spilled. Do you see the participles in this sentence? There are two, crying and spilled. So are these being used as verbs or as adjectives? So if you look at the information around it, you can see here we have a helping verb, and here we have a helping verb before it. So that means that these are being used as verbs. So there's a present participle and past participle verbs. Now look at this sentence. But there's no use crying over spilled milk. Do you see the participles here? Again, there are two, crying and spilled. Are these being used as adjectives or as verbs? So again, look at where they are and what's around them. So there's no use crying over spilled milk. Now, before crying, there's no helping verb. And before spilled, there's no helping verb, which means these are being used as adjectives. Because here, crying is describing the use, and spilled is describing the milk. So there's no helping verb, and they are describing nouns. Here, this one's before the noun. This one is after the noun. So these are participles being used as adjectives. And that's it for this lesson. I hope this was helpful for you in understanding participles, and thanks for watching.